We've sort of abandoned Christmas sweaters altogether and have just gone straight to Christmas pajamas at this point, but it's alright. I'm in my Jessica Day era and I'm not mad about it. Welcome back to Bookmas. Today, I'm going to be sharing a list of winter book recommendations for you to read. These are going to be books that you can read in December around the holidays, but they are not holiday specific. They're just winter specific. So December, January, February, any of that time, these would be perfect books for you to read. And I think they fit into the winter reading category because during the winter, I think we all spend a lot of time inside, depending on where you live, obviously. But for those of us that have the 4 seasons, we spend a lot of time inside during the winter, and there's not always a ton of things to do to fill your time besides read, especially for the book lovers there. So winter is always the time that I actually try to tackle my thicker books or some denser books or books that are maybe a little bit more intimidating for me. For whatever reason, I always associate those with being read in the winter just because I'm spending so much time inside by the fire. The vibes are great. There's always candles lit. I've always got a blanket. So it just feels really nice to be inside and reading. And so these are kind of the books that I've compiled for that type of list. And I'm hoping that you're able to find a couple to add to your winter TBR. So grab your drink, whether you're going for a hot tea or I have opted back for a fizzy drink this time just because I missed it. Get cozy, get settled, and let's get into it. The first book that I'm going to recommend is The Wishing Game by Meg Schaefer. I read this one last December, but I think it was after Christmas, so it was just kind of around a cozy time. This book I think is a great winter recommendation just because it is very heartwarming, it's very lighthearted, it's very sweet. Honestly, the best word that I can think of to describe this book is gentle. So this follows our main character Lucy, who comes from a pretty tough childhood. She describes not having parents that expressed much love towards her or compassion towards her, and the way that she would find those things that were missing from her life was reading her favorite book series as a child called the Clock Island series. The Clock Island series was written by Jack Masterson, who wrote all of these books in this beloved children's series. He is very, very famous because of it, very wealthy, very well off, but after the Clock Island series, he has not written anything for decades. And everybody is wondering what happened to this author, Jack Masterson, that this whole generation of children grew up reading his books and grew up loving them so much, including our main character, Lucy. Lucy is now, I think, 26 years old at the start of this book, and she's a teacher's aide, and she actually works in a school where there are a lot of foster kids, and there's this one kid that she really, really wants to adopt, and that's kind of her motivation throughout this entire book, is trying to adopt this kid that she has a really close relationship to. And I thought that that was actually something really interesting for a character to have as a motivation, especially someone that is, in this book, she's single and she's young. She's 26 years old, but she is very ready to adopt this 7-year-old boy, and that's what's driving her throughout this entire journey. The problem is she can't adopt him because she has zero money, because she's a teacher's aide. But an opportunity presents itself when Jack Masterson comes back from being a hermit and a recluse and writes one more book. Basically, he's saying this is going to be my last book ever. I haven't written in decades, but I'm writing one more book. There's one copy of a manuscript, and he invites a couple very specific people to his home, which happens to be an island, to compete in a set of riddles and games in order to win the manuscript to his last ever book. And Lucy is one of those people that's invited. So she goes there. There's a couple other characters. A lot of them are characters that also grew up reading the Clock Island series and reading Jack Masterson. There's some people that are just in it for the money and just want to get this manuscript for the book, but a lot of them are driven by nostalgia and childhood wonder and wanting to be able to read another work by Jack Masterson. So that's kind of the setup and the premise of this book. I thought that it was really, again, just sweet, cozy, and easy read. I really liked our main character, Lucy, and again, I really did like that her motivation was trying to adopt this kid. I think that that is not super normal for these types of characters, especially ones that are written to be younger and single and not really looking for like a romance or a family. She just knows out of the goodness of her heart, I have to adopt this kid and give him a life that I never got in my childhood. So there's a lot of things that are dealt with in this book with children and family and parents and just being kind to other people, all kind of wrapped up in something that's just very whimsical and fun. This book is extremely extremely whimsical. That is a great word for it. And it's just cozy, and it was a fun read for me last year during the winter, and I think that other people would enjoy reading this and adding it to their winter TBR. The next book is a little bit less fun and a little bit less cozy, but really good. I've talked about it before on this channel, and it is Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. One of the reasons why I think this book is great to read in the winter is, one, it takes place in a lot of winter settings. A lot of this book, especially in the beginning, happens at Harvard, where our main characters are attending for school, and it's cold up there, and it takes place in a lot of the winter months, and so the setting is just described as being blistery, wintry, there's snow on the ground, and just having that visualization as you're reading it automatically makes this a really fun read for winter. But the other reason why I think it's really good for winter is because it is a bit of a dense book and a dense plot. There's a lot going on. It's not the easiest read in the world. There's many moving parts, many characters to keep track of, and so for me it required a lot of focus and just being able to hone in on the plot and the characters. And again, I think winter is such a great time to do that because, at least for me, I'm inside anyway. I'm not making plans after work or at the end of the day to go out and do things. I'm mostly just planning on being home and curling up by the fire and reading as much as possible. So that's why I think that this is a really good winter book. It follows Sam as our main character, and there's a couple other side characters as well that are pretty prominent in this story, one of them being Sadie. Sam and Sadie meet at school, and they decide to develop a video game together. The story begins in the early 90s, and it goes for the next 30 years. You're with these characters, following through their lives, their successes, their failures, what they're trying to do in their life, and how their relationship evolves through that. They build this video game in the early 90s that is a huge success, and pretty instantly they are catapulted into the tech world, into stardom, Silicon Valley. They're developing more video games. They're building a company trying to develop more video games, trying to chase the success of their very first one. And like I said, it spans over so many years, and these characters change. You meet them when they're in college. We go until they're basically middle age, and so many things happen to them. There's great loves of their lives, there's great losses of their lives, grief, success, all of this stuff plays into these characters changing and evolving throughout the story, and it's really beautiful to read. It's also really sad and tragic sometimes, but really beautiful to spend so much time with these characters and see how much life changes them and how the story changes them. And I think Gabrielle Zevin did such a good job at treating these characters with respect, but also challenging them to grow and to change and to develop. This for me is such a character book, and that's why I love it so much, being a character reader myself. I also really like the setting, and learning about video games and how they're developed, and that entire world is just personally very interesting to me. So that was already a bit of a hook, coupled with how good I think the character writing in this is, and the writing as a whole. I just think Gabrielle Zevin is so freaking cool. I really want to read The Storied Life pretty early in January as well. I still need to get a copy. Anyway, back to Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. I think this is a really strong contender for winter books to be added to your TBR, so definitely don't pass this up if you haven't read it already. Moving right along to one that I have talked about many times on this channel, and I'm gonna shamelessly talk about it again. It's ThePhilosophers Flight by Tom Miller. This is such a great book to me. It's one of my favorites of all time. I have to say that one of the reasons I'm suggesting this as a winter read is, one, because of the setting. It takes place in a school during a lot of winter months when there is described snow on the ground. It's wintry, it's blistery, it's cold, it's dark, and I look outside and I see the same thing happening, and I feel even more connected to the story at that time. I also think that this is one of those fantasy books that has some pretty dense world building in the beginning that you sort of have to really commit to and really trudge through in order to get to the actual meat of the plot. And again, I think that winter is just the perfect time to read a book like this and commit to a book like this. But this follows our main character, Robert, who one day discovers that he is able to practice empirical philosophy. Empirical philosophy in this world is kind of just another another name for magic, but it's treated as more of a science than it is wizardry, ethereal concept of magic, if that makes sense. It's more of a scientific art in this book. The interesting thing about it is that pretty much only females can practice it. The field of empirical philosophy is heavily female dominated. There's only been a few males in the history of what this book tells us and what is recorded that have ever been able to practice it, and all of a sudden Robert is able to practice it, which is really cool. But it does mean that he is thrust into a world where he is an odd man out. He is absolutely the black sheep of the group that he's thrown into and mixed in. He goes to the best school in the country to practice empirical philosophy, and he really has to work super, super hard at this magic system that he's learning for the first time, while being pretty much an outcast with all of these women and girls around that definitely don't want him there. And that alone is such a fun concept to me. There's also a war going on, some fighting going on, and Robert is training to be part of the rescue and evacuation corps because, oh, there goes the fire. Because he has an affinity for flying specifically when it comes to empirical philosophy, which is really cool. This feels like, to me, kind of an adult Harry Potter book, and Harry Potter is really fun to read in the winter too, but I loved this one. I loved the writing. Robert as a main character was so enjoyable to read about, and the entire world of empirical philosophy is a very fun concept to me and something really unique that I've never read before or really since then. So definitely add this one to your winter TBR. All right, next, I think I included this series on fantasy books that I think are underhyped, or maybe just books in general that are underhyped. I know I've talked about this before, but I haven't gone into a lot of detail about it, but I definitely wanted to include it here because it's basically the #1 book series that I always recommend to read in winter, and that is The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden. The other books in the series are The Girl in the Tower is book 2, and The Winter of the Witch is book 3. This book is heavily influenced by Russian folklore, and it takes place in Russia in kind of an ambiguous time. I'm actually not sure the year that it takes place in, but we're kind of old school Russia where they are relying on the folklore of that time. There's lots of gods and spirits of that time that Russia is rooted in and used to dealing with, but all of a sudden there's this surge of Christianity that comes and is basically threatening the Russian old lore gods of the time. So our main character is Vasya, and her story begins in her small village when her dad remarries and suddenly she gets a stepmother. This stepmother ends up being pretty terrible and pretty abusive to Vasya, but more than that, she kind of is starting to take control of the village, and really she is one of the ones that's really pushing Christianity onto everybody. But that's very much upsetting the balance of the village and the outlying forests and towns themselves, just because there's lots of spirits around that are suddenly being threatened, and the way that that affects the village is more physically and environmentally. Like there's storms, there's things that happen in the environment that are really a problem for people in the village. Vasya is a very unique person because she can actually see the spirits and she can see all of the gods of the old Russian folklore. And so the beginning of this book is Vasya just kind of trying to find a voice and trying to stand up for what she knows is right and be a confident woman. And I liked starting with her when she's so young. She definitely kind of grows up through the 3 books. It's a really beautiful journey to go on. She meets this deity of Russia that is kind of the equivalent of maybe a Jack Frost or the god of winter, and there's some stuff that goes on there that's fun and a lot of romantic tension that is great to read about. But mostly it's just Vasya becoming a woman. It felt a lot like a coming of age story set in the backdrop of fairy tale Russia, which was really, really fun. And obviously this is a great winter read because the god of winter and snow and darkness and Russia. You should absolutely read this, especially if you're looking to read a series at some point this winter. And then my next recommendation for a winter read is honestly just go find a classic that you've been wanting to read for a while. I think one of the greatest ones that you can read during the winter is Little Women, which is honestly no surprise. I'm sure there are a lot of people recommending that you read this during the winter. I'm just going to add my voice to the mix, put my stamp of approval on it. You should read Little Women this winter if you haven't before, or if you're looking to read a classic or reread a classic or whatever you're looking for. Little Women is such a good pick. It follows the March sisters characters, and it's really just about female relationships, female friendships, sisters, mother, father. It's kind of just dropping into the middle of this family and watching their life play out. It's so beautifully written. You get so attached to all of the characters immediately. Like, I am so invested in these characters' lives and their stories and the romances and how they're growing up, and it's just so beautifully written. I love everything about it. Also, Greta Gerwig's Little Women is one of my top Christmas movies that I have to watch every single year. But even if you can't read this around Christmas time, I think it's still really, really good to read January and February, just because the story does span a lot of different months and time frames and years, and it's just such a good one to pick up. So if you're looking for a classic specifically, definitely reach for Little Women. Now, for me personally, I always find that at the beginning of the year in January, I want to reread something. A lot of the times I want to reread something from my childhood or just an absolute beloved book series or book, just because after December, it's been an entire year of mostly new books. And it's not necessarily that I always feel burnt out. I've never really felt burnt out in January when reading, because I'm mostly just so excited to start another year and to reset my challenges and reset my TBRs. That's always fun for me, and so I feel a lot of motivation in reading in January, but I always find myself gravitating towards the safe books that I've read before, fantasy series that I used to read as a child, just because it's something familiar and it's like a way to start out the year where I know that it's going to be a hit and that it's going to be rewarding and fun for me. So a lot of the times I have a hard time not reaching for either a Percy Jackson book or Harry Potter as well. Percy Jackson, setting-wise, does not feel as wintry unless you're reading maybe The Titan's Curse, which does take place in the winter. Harry Potter, all of the books in the series feel very, very wintry to me, but I think that they both accomplish the same thing that I'm feeling when wanting to read winter books, which is just something familiar, something to bridge the gap between a long year of reading at the end of December to something where I'm starting new with fresh footing and knowing that these are going to be such a good read for me. So if you have a book like that you always tend to gravitate towards, I'd love to know what it is for you. I know some people want to go back and read Aragon or a Lord of the Rings reread, or maybe like a Narnia series, something that they have history with, that they've read 4 years ago, whatever it is. I'm super interested what that series is for you, because it's probably Percy Jackson and Harry Potter for me. And then I also tend to gravitate towards fantasy at the beginning of the year, but specifically fantasy series. I don't know what it is about starting in January, but it's always the time that I want to dive headfirst into a long fantasy series. So I have a couple recommendations here for you if you're looking specifically for a series. One of those is the Lunar Chronicles. It starts with Cinder. These are fairy tale retellings. I think they follow Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood, Rapunzel, and Snow White. I think there's 4 books in the original series, and then there's a couple novellas and a book that focuses more on the antagonist in this series. But the first 4 books focus on retelling those fairy tale series, all under like a steampunk backdrop, which is really fun. This is a young adult series as well, so I do find that they're really quick and easy to get through, and I like the world a lot, and I like the characters a lot. This is a good option if you're just wanting to crank through a series to start the year, and if you like those old fairy tales and want to see them with a little bit more of a twist. And then obviously I would be remiss if I didn't mention Throne of Glass here. I'm mostly mentioning it because I think this is going to be the very first thing that I read in January. I read the Throne of Glass series maybe 2 years ago for the very first time. I had really put it off for a long time. Many years ago, I tried to read this book, and honestly, I didn't like it. I think the writing in Throne of Glass, the first book, and maybe even the second book, is not super good. It's pretty juvenile, it's pretty cringy and cheesy, and I couldn't get through it. So I DNF'd Throne of Glass the very first time that I tried to read it years and years ago. Then I moved on to ACOTAR a little bit later, and ACOTAR has become one of my favorite series of all time. I actually think the writing is a lot better in that one, and it took me a hot second to put together that ACOTAR and Throne of Glass were written by the same person. This was when I was definitely in the dark when it came to anything Sarah J. Maas. So after I finished ACOTAR, I think for the second time, I finally decided that it was probably time for me to read Throne of Glass. I did that about 2 years ago, and I think it may have potentially changed my life. I loved reading that series so much. I loved fully immersing myself into a world. I blazed through the books as quickly as I could. It was so fun, and I just loved every second of it. And since then, I've really been wanting to reread it, but I've felt specifically this entire year that there's just so many new books that I wanted to read that were a higher priority for me. So now that we're resetting in 2025, January is coming. It's when I want to read a long series. It's when I want to read fantasy, and it seems like the perfect time to reread Throne of Glass. Something that I'm very excited about for this second reading of it is to go a bit slower, because I binged it the first time, and I think the speed that I was reading at caused me to miss some things, or maybe just not notice things as deeply as I would if I was really taking my time with it. So I'm excited to slow down, really take my time with it, really get into the story as much as possible. I'm excited to do a tandem read with books 5 and 6, because I didn't do that last time. I didn't even know that was a thing that people could do, but now I found an entire tandem reading schedule that you can follow for those books, and I'm really excited to do that. That will be my first tandem read that I've ever done. I am also excited to read Assassin's Blade because I've never read that one before. In my first read through of the series, I just skipped Assassin's Blade, I guess. So I'm excited to read that one. I don't know what order I'm going to read the series in, specifically when it comes to Assassin's Blade. I'm sure that there are people that have opinions on it. I think that I've seen people read it first before Throne of Glass, second after Throne of Glass, or third for some reason. I would love your thoughts and your guidance on it. Please tell me when I should read Assassin's Blade in the series. This is less of a recommendation for you to read this winter and more of a representation of a long fantasy series that you should read, and then just an excuse for me to talk about it and to tell you guys what my plan is for Throne of Glass. And then lastly, I do have this trilogy that I've talked about a little bit before. I think is a really underrated trilogy. It's called The Traitor's Kiss, and the other books in the series are The Traitor's Ruin and The Traitor's Kingdom. I have never seen anybody talk about these books. I think that I read it on a pretty random whim many years ago, maybe like 6 or 7 years ago. I think I just saw it at Barnes & Noble and picked up the first book because it was described as a very loose retelling / inspired by story of Mulan. And I would stress that it is a loose retelling of Mulan, but there are some Mulan aspects of it that were very fun. It kind of follows our main character Sage, who works for a matchmaker in her town. She ends up having to take this group of women to the capital kingdom, the main castle area, and wherever they live. She has to escort them to all go to this political ball to make all of their matches and their marriage prospects happen. She is not really eligible because she's kind of more of a tomboy, doesn't really want to be married, hasn't found anybody that she's interested in, and is basically unmatchable, but she's really good at matching other people. So she is escorting them to the kingdom. However, there is a lot of political intrigue and betrayal and all of these things that are happening. There's a lot of unrest in the kingdom itself. All of these women that are going to the capital to get matched with high up leaders of the kingdom, they are kind of a liability because they're enemies in the kingdom. It would benefit them if they were to go after this caravan and kill all of the women so that their high up men can't marry and procreate and strengthen the kingdom, if that makes sense. So this caravan of women has a very strong guard around them, and Sage, for whatever reason, has to go undercover as a man, and then she gets really close to one of the captains of the guard that's protecting all of the women, but he doesn't know that she's actually a female, and it kind of goes from there. That's a little bit of the Mulan aspect of it, but for whatever reason, I just love this trilogy. I've read it twice. It's kind of a comfort read for me. It's definitely young adult. It's definitely a quick read. Because I haven't seen anybody talk about it ever, I feel the need to put it in front of people if you're looking for a fun little sweet trilogy to read in the winter as well. Oh my goodness. That is so many books that we just talked about. I can't even hold them up probably because it's so many books, but here they all are. If you can't find a single book to add to your TBR list out of this stack here, then I don't know how to help you. I don't know what to do for you, but hopefully there is something for everybody in this list. And I hope you find something that you love. Let me know what you're planning on reading this winter and specifically in 2025 at the start of January. I'd love to know all of your picks and recommendations and your thoughts. As always, thank you so much for hanging out with me on this corner of the internet, and we will see you next time.